New York City thing. Anyway, I'm just calling in because this fake White Hawk guy, he looks weird. He's always lying. And I want to ask him how he knows all this stuff and why is it he says it like the way he wants to say it. He doesn't say it the way how it's supposed to be. He has like that left bullshit mentality in his mind.
Keep it clean, Tapface. You said he's lying?
I mean, yeah, he's lying about everything that he's saying. The stuff that he's saying, I want to know where does he get his information, not the news. Like, why is he saying the way he's saying it? Because the way he's saying it is like he's starting trouble.
Like I'm in trouble?
Like you're starting trouble.
Like I'm starting trouble? Well,
yes,
I guess
starting trouble.
Wow. Well, I think it was the Russians who started the trouble. But I would say that
I'm fucking starting trouble.
Tapface,
I will knock you the fuck
out. You know what? We have our guest on the line, live, I think, from Bulgaria. Dylan Burns is back. Dylan Burns TV on YouTube and Twitch, and actually on Twitter too. But he's also Dylan Burns 1776, his personal account on Twitter. A war journalist, he guesses, which is cool. Environmental City Board member on the board of directors at Free State. Recent fallen state guest with JLP on January, I think. Host of the Hippy Dippy Roundtable, which I've appeared on many times, a number of times. And you can catch Dylan's prior interview on my show from January 12th. We talked about January 6th, the Proud Boys, his experience with Proud Boys over in D.C., slavery, was slavery so bad, and other things. So today we're going to talk about Ukraine versus Russia, and he's a foreign policy enthusiast, if you're not aware. And if he wants to talk about the Buffalo grocery store shooting and possibly the Supreme Court, I believe Dylan Burns is a pro-choice Christian. And I think that he is up. You up for taking calls on?
I'll take some calls. Sure,
right,
of
cool.
course.
So
I love your audience. They're
nice.
lovely.
So you guys can call in 888-775-3773. Welcome back, Dylan. I appreciate you coming back on the Hake Report.
Happy to be here. I'm actually not in Bulgaria. I'm in Lviv, Ukraine at the moment.
Okay. Wow. Lviv, Ukraine. Is that southeastern Ukraine or is it western?
Western Ukraine.
Okay. Nice. Wow. So what's your take on the whole Ukraine situation?
Well, I believe that the Russian state invaded Ukraine for its own geopolitical interests. It has interests in holding ties to the Ukrainian economy very deeply. It has strategic ties to Ukraine, and it has historical ties. I think people underplay the historical ties that it has to Ukraine as to why it's invaded. But if you listen to Putin's speech, he's pretty clear. He believes that the Ukrainian state is artificial. He believes that Russia has done much for Ukraine, and therefore it has a sort of brother relationship with Ukraine. It has some relationship where Ukraine is little Russians, much like the Turkish community in Turkey talks much about how the Kurds are mountain Turks historically. I believe that Ukraine has a right to self-determination. I believe it has a right to manage its own affairs when it comes to economy, when it comes to alliances, when it comes to trade relations, and what agreements it agrees to and doesn't. And I also believe that the Ukrainian population have a right to live without fear of Russian bombardment and rape by Russian soldiers and all the brutality that they've been facing. So I'm very, very pro-Ukraine in this conflict. I think there's a reason why you see so many of the former Soviet countries moving away from Russia's influence. Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, Romania. There's a reason why these countries no longer want to stay with Russia, and it's because they all have historical relationships being abused by Russia and told what to do by Russia. The Russians were the most dominant during the Soviet Union, and before the Soviet Union, the Russians dominated the Polish community and the Ukrainians before that too. In fact, the Russians even banned the Ukrainian language and literature and targeted Ukrainian culture. And so it's not that surprising that the Ukrainians know what their relationship with the Russians have been historically and don't want much to do with it right now, definitely since they're being invaded and having their population killed by them.
Is there any truth to what Putin has said about the historical things and his interests? Is there any truth to what he's been saying?
I would say that Russia has interests in Ukraine, of course. It has strategic interests and economic interests. But once you meddle in a country's internal affairs by fomenting corruption, or you trying to assassinate politicians, or you try to ban that people's language, what you do is you start to sour that historical relationship. You start to sour those feelings of brotherhood once you abuse a nation in that way. I mean, if I told you, hey, we're friends, but I come up every day and I slap you upside the head, eventually that friendly demeanor is not going to really mean very much since I'm, slapping you upside the head. And I feel that is the Russian relationship with the Ukrainians. And I would also say that many of the things Putin said, while true, other things he said were falsehoods. One example of this was his idea that Ukraine is an artificial state created by Vladimir Lenin. Even though the state of Ukraine was not actually created by Vladimir Lenin, it was created before Vladimir Lenin. And the culture of Ukraine, the language of Ukraine, Ukrainian literature, the Cossacks, all of this predated the Soviet Union, predated even the advent of communism in and of itself through Karl Marx in his writings. And so I feel that he tried to underemphasize Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian history. I mean, Kiev existed before Moscow did.
I have my take on Ukraine is I feel that NATO is also evil and lying, like the U.S. establishment. I just don't trust them. They push all kinds of suspect things, in my opinion. And, Biden, I don't feel that he's really that solid of a guy. Is NATO wrong in the stuff that they're doing? Are they continuing, for example, like my take is by funding Ukraine's fight, they're kind of enabling Ukraine to keep on having more and more people die, and it's causing more suffering than is necessary. What would you say to that?
So I've interviewed a lot of Ukrainians about this issue, specifically Ukrainian refugees, women who have left their homes and had to flee to Poland. I interviewed a lot of them in Poland, and the number one consensus I've gotten from them is that they want more aid. And many of these women want to go back and fight themselves, but can't because they have children to take care of, and in their family, that's the role of the mom, and the child would have nowhere else to go if they went to go fight. I have yet to interview a single Ukrainian, and my job over here is to interview Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees who are saying, let's give up. Let's stop taking the aid. Let's concede some land. Maybe give him the Donbass. Maybe give him Kherson in the south. Maybe give him all of them have shown an extreme amount of patriotism in the way of, we are not going to let them do what they did in Bucha. We're not going to let them kill our people, rape our women, and do this, and let them get away with it, and then say, here's the reward, here's our land. We're giving up our land. Because if we see what the Russians did in these locations that they took, that the Ukrainians have taken back in the Kiev Oblast, we can only imagine what they've been doing in occupied territory. And if the Ukrainians sign that away forever, who knows what's going to happen to the people who are loyal to perhaps the Ukrainian language, or they are loyal to the Ukrainian state and they want to live as Ukrainians. What is going to happen to them? Who knows what's going to happen to them? And I don't think anybody should be told you have to give up your land until they say, okay, we've had enough, we quit. I think it's up to the Ukrainians to determine that. Once the Ukrainians say we want to throw in the towel, I'll 100% back them, despite what NATO says. But until they say that, I think we should continue to support them.
You mentioned that Ukraine and Russia was inserting corruption into Ukraine. Is it not true that Ukraine is already corrupt, even more corrupt than Russia without? I don't know if you can say without Russia because they're not exactly without.
Most post-Soviet countries, especially Eastern European countries, and I don't care what anybody says, they can say, oh, this is impolite, but it's true, have a very high levels of corruption in their civil administration, very high levels of corruption in the government. Russia has a very high level of corruption. You can even see that now through their military's low levels of performance. Ukraine has high levels of corruption. A lot of Eastern Moldova has high levels of corruption. This is not something that is special to any of these countries, right? And so to me, the Russians basically, in their relationship with Ukraine, took advantage of the fact that Ukraine has a corrupt nation state to try to benefit their own state interests. And this is something that countries do all the time with other countries. that they have geopolitical interests in. But it's not good because that just makes the corruption worse. And so if you're a civil society activist trying to deal with corruption in your country because you want politicians to be honest, very high order, I will say, to get a politician to not lie to you. But if you want politicians to be honest and not corrupt, it's going to be difficult if you have outside actors trying to foment that corruption in order to benefit their state. But I wouldn't say Ukraine's any more corrupt than Russia. I would say from all the data I've looked at, they're similar levels of corruption.
Would you, man, there was something you mentioned Bucha. Bucha is where the media was showing all these images of dead bodies, and they were saying that Russia did that. Was that proven? Because I know that the State Department or the Pentagon was saying at first that they didn't have independent proof. Has that changed?
So there's a lot of different evidence that's been shown. There's been evidence of Russian soldiers directly shooting women on bikes that I could send you if you wanted me to send you that. It was from a Russian armored vehicle marked with the markings. This was while it was occupied. It was done through surveillance camera footage. There's other footage of people running away from Russian soldiers unarmed, not even running away, just walking away. Russian soldiers coming behind them and shooting them in the back. That is verified, and I can send you that. There's a lot of satellite images from the time it was occupied by Russia of these bodies being there. And I think that it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to sneak bodies into Russian occupied territory, then leave just for these satellite images to take pictures of them. There's also been some conspiracies thrown around about it. One conspiracy people talk about a lot is this footage. I don't know if you've seen it. There's this hand that moves while the people are driving through this town with the dead bodies. If you actually look at the footage a little closer, and you don't look at the blurry version, it's just a raindrop going down the windowsill. It's not a hand moving on a dead body, not a 20-day later muscle spasm. I think people just don't want to believe that these types of brutality happen. That people want to believe, that nobody would do something so brutal, so disgusting. But I think if you talk to a lot of veterans from wars that have been particularly brutal, you can hear them that when there's military catastrophe and you lose half your platoon, you lose half your battalion, you lose a bunch of buddies, there's no progress. A lot of times soldiers incorrectly will translate that violence, definitely that anger, into the civilian population of the land that they captured. And I think that might be what happened here, that these Russian soldiers committed acts of brutality that are not supposed to be seen on God's green earth.
Is I mentioned when I appeared on Hippy Dippy that they were arming civilians, right? And they were not uniformed civilians, and I got mocked for it a little bit, but the point is, have there been civilians who've gone after Russians, and would that be why they may be more jumpy towards civilians, even innocent ones?
There have been instances of brutality that I've seen. I haven't seen any executions or anything, but instances of and I haven't actually seen it directed towards Russians. It's actually the instances I've seen have been the Romani community, better known as gypsies.
Gypsies in Ukraine going against Ukrainian soldiers or something?
Well, they're not going against anybody. They're just people are they're scared because there's missiles and bombings and half their family's dead and they don't know what to do. And I condemn that wholeheartedly. But my position on arming civilians, and I guess I get some heat from this sometimes on the left, is I think that's perfectly fine in a scenario like this. That when it comes to the civilian population, if your population has high morale and they're willing to defend your population, as long as you're not forcing guns into their hands and just throwing them at the enemy, I think that's perfectly fine. I understand that can come with terrible consequences as people who are not as trained as normal regular soldiers are given firearms. But if they're given a minimal amount of training and they're willing to fight, I think that's perfectly permissible given the situation of the Russian army invading your country, trying to erase its sovereignty.
How about the leader of Ukraine, this President Volodymyr Zelensky?
Yep.
I've heard JLP, you've talked with Jesse Lee Peterson, comment that this guy is on an ego trip. He'll appear at the Grammys over over Skype or whatever, and he'll do this and that, and he's just, I've heard stories that he's not allowing men ages, 18 to 60 to leave the country, but he is letting Israelis or Jewish people, the Jewish population, be an exception to that. I don't know if I've heard that. What's your take on him? Do you have any criticisms for him or praise for him?
So my thing is, I look at Zelensky like I look at most politicians, right? I don't look at them as these grand moral arbiters where we need to go up and bow to them as if they're perfect men or perfect people. Politicians are politicians. There are people who have worked their whole life to get to these positions of power, and that means many times they've had to make immoral and amoral decisions in order to get there, right? Usually, if you're at the highest position of power, you're not a saint, right? When it comes to Zelensky, though, I would say that he is somebody I respect immensely, definitely as an American, because we saw what happened in Afghanistan. Ashraf Ghani, the leader of the Afghan National Army, the leader of Afghanistan, immediately, once the going got tough and the Taliban looked like they had the upper hand, that guy filled suitcases full of money and fled the country. Yeah. He got out of there. That 20 years became nothing for Americans because we didn't have a population that we thought was willing to fight, or there was too much corruption and they didn't want to defend corruption and a guy who's fleeing the country. Whereas Zelensky, once given the offer to leave, he rejects it. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. He stays in the capital city as Russian troops, in one of the longest military columns we've seen in the modern era, approaches the city and they try to encircle it as they approach Kharkiv, as they approach Sumy, as they approach Cherniv. And even if there's certain personal political disagreements I can have with the man, I kind of view it in a way kind of like George Washington. I respect a man, definitely a political leader, who is willing to actually put himself in harm's way in order to stand up to his country. And that's why all the Ukrainians I've talked to, even many of them who didn't support him before the war, have nothing but praise for him now.
Did you
Not to mention,
yeah, go ahead.
One last thing. When it comes to him going to the Grammys and all these things, this is somebody who was on a TV show about being president and then became president. Yeah. You know, he was, I would say, almost Donald Trump before Trump, or was it after Trump? I forget. I think it was maybe slightly after when it comes to his like a TV stardom. And he understands the usefulness of social media. He understands the usefulness of mass media, which is a great way to communicate with people. And he has used it to get the whole world in support of Ukraine, to get the whole world to pressure their politicians to support Ukraine with arms, aid, ammunition. And it has even led to many foreign volunteers coming to Ukraine and picking up arms in defense of the country. So I would say he has made use of his personal skills he's obtained through his time in the workforce.
That's partly why I have a lot of qualms and I just am resistant to joining the bandwagon for Ukraine, is because all of these institutions that I just spurn, if that's the right word for it, like, you know, the Grammys, these stars, the social media establishment that, you know, promotes this, support Ukraine, we support Ukraine. The liberals in my neighborhood, some of them fly Ukraine flags. And it reminds me of like the Black Lives Matter bandwagon, the Me Too bandwagon, and all these things that I just instinctively and morally just don't want to support. I can't necessarily put my finger on what's always wrong with Ukraine, other than that NATO is involved, and I haven't really liked what NATO's been about lately. So what would don't you see that that's partly like having a negative effect on a significant part of the population?
Well, hey, I would say I'm somebody who supports the Second Amendment, right? And as a Democrat, I'm not supposed to do that, right? That's not supposed to be my job. My job's supposed to be to take the guns away, right? And if somebody was to come to me and say, well, Dylan, did you know that those racists like guns? Did you know those sexists like guns? Those bad people and all those, you know, those Republicans like guns, Dylan? I wouldn't turn to them and say, oh, snap, you've scared me out of it. Now I don't want to support guns anymore. I would say, no, I have a principled attachment to the Second Amendment. I don't care what you try to scare me out of it with, oh, this person I don't like likes guns, or this person I don't likes guns. If I, as a person, look at the values attached to the Second Amendment, I agree with them, then I'm going to support the Second Amendment. And I would say the same thing should apply to an issue like Ukraine. You shouldn't just look at, well, this person I don't like supports it, so I'm going to be against it. Because that feels like you're almost getting like scared out of it by the people you don't like. It shouldn't be that. You should just simply look at the morals of the issue, look at which side did what, why is this country invading, why is this country defending itself so effectively, and then come to your own conclusion. You shouldn't look around to everyone else to see what you should jump on the bandwagon. In fact, they are getting you onto a reverse bandwagon because you're letting those people dictate what you believe just in reverse. You should find that out yourself.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily believing one way or the other, although I do very much like poo-poo the stuff that I do hate news on the Jesse Lee Peterson show. So I'll read our daily dose of Ukraine propaganda from CNN, for example. And so I'll read it kind of incredulously. Man, there was something I wanted to ask. Has the U.S. meddled in Ukraine? You mentioned Russia has with corrupt intentions. Has the U.S. done the same?
We have been involved in Ukraine. We want Ukraine to serve American interests, just like every major country wants any country in a strategically important position to serve its interests. There are some things that are alleged when it comes to like Newman phone calls and stuff like that, which are insignificant and they're not really showing evidence. I think if people really wanted to, the most obvious example would be the United States gave Ukraine money, it gave it aid, it gave it support against a neighbor that was trying to like infringe on its territory, infringe on its sovereignty, and therefore Ukraine has now looked upon the United States favorably. And I would say that would be the meddling I would point to. But to me, is that really that bad? I mean, as if you're a Ukrainian and you're looking at the United States and it's like, well, the United States gave us aid, and that aid was, it made us support America, or the military aid they sent us. As a Ukrainian, none of these things sound like bad things to me. I mean, I haven't spoken to any Ukrainian and seen the bad approval ratings for American politicians. In fact, in Ukraine, Joe Biden has like a 77% approval rating, which is much higher than what it is in the United States, because Ukrainians generally like the United States. And I, as an American, kind of like that feeling.
How did they like Donald Trump? I don't know. Did they have polls on Trump?
not as favorable from what I recall. Not as favorable. A lot of it came from the phone call specifically about the idea that Trump was holding up aid to Zelensky. They see Joe Biden as a lot more supportive over Ukraine.
All right. What about the Eastern Ukrainians who want to be part of Russia? Isn't there a significant population that wants to be independent, tried to declare independence? Hasn't there been long fighting in that area?
So since 2014, there have been rebellions in the east of Ukraine sponsored by the Russian government. The Russian government gave them guns, they gave them weapons, they even had soldiers in the region. And that rebellion was in the Donbass, which is specifically Donetsk and Luhansk. And the polling there's no clear polling showing that the region of the Donbass wants to leave and be part of Russia that I can find. For me, I'm a very simple person. I believe that you should hold democratic elections and stuff like that to determine these types of things. Now, obviously, the circumstances show that that isn't the case. And so from my discussions with Russian-speaking Ukrainians, any hope of a kind of Donbass Russian state being seen favorably by Ukrainians is dead. All the Eastern Ukrainian Russian speakers I've spoken to talk to me as if either A, I didn't ever really like Putin, but now I despise the man. He's bombing my home. He's bombing my village. I lost my uncle. I lost my daughter. I lost my so-and-so. I hate him. I want to see the man dead. And the other ones, and these are the ones, if you go to Moldova, you're going to find a lot of people like this. I trusted him. I can't believe I trusted him. I trusted him to resolve this conflict, and I trusted him, and I believed what he said. And now my home is gone. Now I've lost everything I own. And I wanted to trust Putin. I thought he was a straight shooting man, but now I can't look at him the same way anymore. My son was shot by his soldiers. I can't believe it. And so to me, it feels like that debate on Eastern Ukraine and what their views on Vladimir Putin and Russia would be has kind of been answered by Vladimir Putin, because the main population that has been displaced, the main population that's being killed in Kharkiv and Mariupol and the Donbass, they're Russian speakers.
I'm just curious, do you have translators through whom you're talking to these people?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Why does NATO keep on expanding? They seem to, Ukraine is not even part of NATO, but somehow NATO is It's basically Russia versus kind of NATO by way of Ukraine, in my eyes. And that's partly why I am leery about this whole situation. But even after the USSR ended, NATO has continued, even though NATO was to oppose the Soviet Union. Why has NATO continued to like expand and try to support expansion? And are they wrong?
There was this question after the Soviet Union fell that was kind of, and this was a question that many people have been asking is, what's NATO around to do anymore? I mean, NATO was created under this idea that we need to beat the commies, right?
You know, and now the NATO are the commies. In my opinion.
I don't know if they are the commies, but the better dead than red is the idea, right? And then the Soviet Union fell. But what happened is we saw countries like Poland, we saw countries like Hungary, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all these countries run, and it almost, the only way I could really paint it is if they begged to be allowed into NATO, because they knew that right now Russia was down, but Russia's not out. They got the 8 count, but they're going to get back up eventually. And when they get back up, they're going to start making their own alliances. They're going to start enforcing their own interests. They're going to start trying to influence politics across the region. And they want a defensive shield to protect their sovereignty and democracies. And ultimately, I think that ended up being true. And we can see that through Ukraine, that Ukraine was the one country in the Europe that we see that didn't end up joining NATO. And what happened to Ukraine? Poland is not being invaded. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, countries much weaker and with much lesser populations than Ukraine, are not being invaded. It is the one country that's not part of NATO that's being invaded. And for me, I was actually always a person, and I'm still trying to figure out my position on it to be like my specific position on it. I was a person who was like, NATO doesn't really, maybe not even have a place in the 21st century. I mean, the Soviets are beat, but now it feels like the Russians have answered for most Europeans and most NATO member states why NATO still exists. And if you look at places like Finland and Sweden, you've seen support for joining NATO jump through the roof because now they're scared. They're scared what if Russian encroachment is next on their doorstep?
Is Turkey going to be able to stop that?
That's interesting because Turkey doesn't seem, at least we know publicly, seem to have a strategic reason for not wanting Finland and Sweden in. Their main concern seems to be in relation to specifically the PKK and the Kurds. They see Finland and these states as nations that are too friendly to the Kurdish population. Erdogan has now taken like a hard stance, like, oh, we don't need Finland and Sweden over here into Ankara. I say give that some time. I think that might be banging their chest in order. It's tough negotiating tactics, possibly. So maybe they could get concessions on that. There is the possibility that the Russians are whispering in their ears, since the Turks famously have a foreign policy that's quite slippery, to say the least. But I would say we can't really make that determination now. We're going to have to wait and see. But Turkey seems to be the main obstacle for Finland joining. The Finnish population want to join. The rest of the NATO states want them to join. And most of the objections that Turkey has pushed forward at this point are things that could be resolved in back rooms.
There's a couple of NATO countries whom I think that you mentioned, whom I respect their domestic policy, at least to a point, like Poland and Hungary. Aren't those countries, haven't they been criticized by some of the rest of the West, so-called West, for being less welcoming to refugees and immigrants and the LGBT agenda and all that stuff? Am I right about those countries?
You're right about the fact they've been criticized. I was actually in Poland for about a month. In Lublin, beautiful city. I recommend it to anyone. The food is amazing. The people are very nice. They care a lot about the family. The one thing I will say though is I spoke to somebody at that's involved with Homofobia, which is a Polish human rights organization, and they were talking about the difference between how the refugees from this war were treated by the Polish government and the refugees from Afghanistan, from Syria, and all the other wars were treated. And I remember asking her, and I'm going to publish this interview in a documentary that I'm making in the region. Why do you think there was a difference in how they were treated, and why the borders opened for these refugees but didn't open for the other ones? And her answer to me was just, I think it was racism. I think that racism played a major role. Whether she's right or not, I guess you can determine that yourself. But I would say that the Polish and Hungarian governments have historically not been very friendly to accepting refugees. But that Poland, due to its shared history of Russian aggression against its statehood, its shared history with under the Soviet Union and the authoritarianism they faced during that, definitely during Polish martial law that was instituted under the Soviet Union, even with the complicated history on the border with the militias that killed each other and the brutal killing between Ukrainian militias and Polish militias, that shared history is really felt in Polish households because they remember what Russia did to them. They remember what the Soviet Union was like in Poland. And so that sympathy has been able to extend to Ukraine.
And the Ukrainians fit in better with people. People may call it racism, but they just fit in better. They have this similar white culture, if you will. They're workers. I've heard from that Bulgarian caller. I accidentally said that you were calling from Bulgaria. The Bulgarian caller whom I wrapped up with at the beginning of the show, he's had like a glowing review for the Ukrainian refugees, that they're older men, get a job right away, the women are working and just being productive rather than like your typical POC refugee, if you will, that has been mostly like many times military age men anyway. And then a lot of times they come in and they just don't have the same values. They don't have the same culture. There's all kinds of problems. Clash of civilizations.
The difference is, like, Poland and Ukraine actually had a clash of civilizations historically. A lot of people don't know there was brutal killings, very brutal killings between Polish and Ukrainians on the border trying to establish, like, this is the Ukrainian border, this is the Polish border. And they really, I could call it nothing else but like murdered each other, right? And so if you look at a lot of Polish nationalists, they're the people who were the most against taking Ukrainian refugees because they looked at it like, we remember what the Ukrainian militias did to Polish people. We remember what they did. Is that they were able to overlook that due to that shared history. I don't think it has to do with, the culture into that. I think it has to more do with that shared history of Russian chauvinism affecting both Ukraine and Russia. And I really think that's the case. And when it comes to work, I spoke to local work offices in Poland, and I can tell you that a lot of these people, they do want to work, but there's not a centralized government response. It is local work offices in local cities that are doing the heavy lifting. The Polish prime minister is not the one who should be getting the credit for here. It is cities like Lublin. It is places like Lechna. These smaller townships and cities that should be getting the most of the credit for the refugee response.
The Azov regiment. Do you know much about what's going on with them? Is there violence on many sides, like Trump has said about other stuff?
I mean, there's violence on all sides. War is war at the end of the day. Anybody who tries to paint war as a pretty picture of here's the really good guys and here's the really bad guys, and the good guys do all the good things and the bad guys do all the bad things. That's a Marvel type look at history, okay? This isn't a Superman comic. This is a war where people are dying. But if you wanted me to map out like exactly who's doing the majority of the dying and who's doing the majority of the killing, the Russians are the one who have killed the majority of the civilians. The Ukrainians are the ones who have done the majority of the dying when it comes to the civilian population. And this is because the Russians are conducting this war within Ukraine. They're the ones bombing maternity hospitals. They're the ones bombing schools. They are the one bombing governmental buildings and civilian infrastructure. They are the ones bombing drama theaters that are clearly marked for civilians and killing hundreds of people. And so, for me, this is kind of like somebody trying to compare American war crimes in Europe to German war crimes in Europe, or somebody trying to compare to me, well, this is what this army, which did 90% of the war crimes, did, but compare it to this 10%, right? It's to me, it's like, yes, those do exist, and those people should be prosecuted, but it is drastically on one side.
Those hospitals and maternity wards and those things, haven't some of those been like with soldiers housed in there, or military stuff being used in any of those schools and hospitals and things?
As far as I know.
Oh man, he froze. Ah, sorry guys. technical difficulties here. We disconnected. Let me read a few super chats before we reconnect. Okay, cool. Are you there?
Yes, I think Putin is taking me out. You were asking about the hospitals. So
Yeah.
I would say, unless you can name me a specific example.
No, I have no examples. I've just heard stuff.
Yeah, I don't have yet to see any significant evidence that any of these were false flag attacks from the Ukrainians or that the Russians were targeting legitimate military targets. I'm sure there have been times when they target a legitimate military target and there might have been civilians in the area. But when it comes to like the drama theater, this is very clear cut. When it comes to the footage of these Russian soldiers shooting people in the back or the woman on the bike or these cases of gang rape by drunk Russian soldiers, which we're seeing more and more cases of, these are very just clear-cut war crimes that you can't really find a strategic justification for. A lot of times it's as simple as you look at a building that's blown up and you ask yourself, what's the strategic significance of this kindergarten way behind enemy lines? There's not a lot of strategic significance to that playpen and that sandbox. I don't think that sandbox is where Ukraine was going to live or die. I think this might have been a war crime. I think it's really as simple as that. And the war crime investigators are finding more and more evidence every day. This is a brutal war. And if you tell your Russian soldiers like, hey, they're all Nazis. They're all Nazis. They're all NATO dogs. They're all this. They're all that. You can build a mentality that like the people we're fighting are complete monsters, and you can justify this stuff to yourself. This type of propaganda that's used.
Yeah, I think that's why we should be resistant to the demonization that's going on in America, because there is a flippant throwing around of the word Nazis against Americans. And you'll see fellow Americans, this is not really to do with Ukraine, but you'll see fellow Americans celebrating or wishing the death upon people whom they disagree with, like maybe Clarence Thomas and some of these justices with the Supreme Court upcoming decisions and stuff like that. People are just so nasty and evil towards each other. We've never been so divided in the country.
We live in a democracy, and you can't live in a democracy if every time you lose, right, your solution is we're going to take up a gun and we're going to start shooting people. Because that's not a democracy, is it? That sounds more like, oh, it's a democracy when I win, never mind when I lose, right? The same thing applies to what happened on January 6th. I mean, the fact of the matter is that you have to learn to live with people you disagree with.
Yeah, but they're just going after the January 6th people. What a shame, huh? You guys can call in 888-775-3773. Anything else you want to mention in the last words about the Ukraine mess?
So I'm filming a documentary. You can find my YouTube channel at Dylan Burns TV. It's going to be released once I'm out of the country. Obviously, I can't release it while I'm in Ukraine. We're getting more and more footage every day, and there's a few stories that really stick with me when it comes to like rape and people trying to defend their homes with Molotov cocktails and stuff. But one thing I want to emphasize is the type of trauma that's being shoved on people who are completely defenseless and innocent. While I was in Poland, I spoke to the headmistress of a preschool. And I sat down with her, and we talked, we did the interview, then we went outside, and we looked at the playground. And on the playground, there were children playing, Polish and Ukrainian children playing together. And she tells me that Lublin is near an airport, and anytime an airplane goes overhead the school and they can hear it, you can tell the Polish and the Ukrainian children apart by which children hit the deck, because they're used to getting bombed, and they know that planes bring death and destruction. And that type of trauma is going to take a lot of work to undo. And that's a way how wars and invasions and this type of death and destruction affects people of every age, way past the end date of any war.
I forgot to ask you, did you catch Nick Fuentes' debate with Destiny on this Russia-Ukraine deal? Did you watch that?
Yeah, I did watch it on my channel. I didn't get to finish it, but I did watch it.
What was your take on Nick Fuentes' defense of Russia's motivation?
Well, I didn't agree with it, obviously. What I was really surprised was how in depth he researched missile control and missile technology. That really surprised me. Nick Fuentes did not peg me for the guy to be that in depth with missile knowledge or researching missiles.
Interesting. You mentioned that the Ukrainians that you've talked to want our help, but why should, say, I support helping them when I see that that's only continuing the death and destruction? Yeah, politically they may have to live with Russia taking over more and more of their land, but at least hopefully the death and perhaps the death and destruction would be mitigated.
I would call it a necessary evil. When you look at the American War of Independence, there could have been an easy time when all the founding fathers get in a circle and said, well, we could fight for our rights. We could fight for the right to private property and all of these other things in this democracy. But then people would die, and that would suck. Therefore, we surrender. They could have done that, but they didn't, because the principles which they were putting their life on the line for and they were risking everything for was more important than the short-term security.
But that was their own.
Yes, that was their own. But for the Ukrainians, that is they're making the decision. They're making the decision. You say, well, this only is increasing to death and destruction. But the Ukrainians are telling you, we are doing this for the principle of our sovereignty, for our independence, for us to be able to manage and rule ourselves. And so as an American, to me, knowing how we got support from the French in order for us to have our independence.
I've heard that.
And that helped us get our long-term sovereignty, our long-term independence, and allowed us to create one of the greatest democracies on the planet. I see this as a continuation of America respecting that tradition in Ukraine.
All right. Nick, does Alex in Sweden want to talk to man, 40 billion, huh? You're for that 40 billion going to Ukraine, or is that true?
Oh yeah.
Man.
40 big ones.
I heard that NATO has how much more of a budget? 10 times the budget of Russia?
10 times the budget of Russia. Yeah, Russia made a very terrible mistake, didn't they?
Man.
I mean, their invasion. I mean, everybody can see now their invasion was poorly planned, poorly executed. They didn't have the logistics. It seems like at every stage of it, they failed. I really think this was an isolated decision made by the top of the Russian leadership, made by a few officials in a windowless room with a single light bulb, and they didn't really think about, well, what if the Ukrainians fight back?
Okay. Well, let me get to Alex in Sweden. He wants to talk with you. Alex,
fantastic.
In Sweden, you're on with Dylan Burns. Are you there? Alex. Going once.
Alex.
Let me get to Tapface in New York City. Alex is not ready. Tapface in New York City, are you there?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Nice.
Oh, you heard?
Yep. What'd you say?
Yeah, no, I said I don't heard. You heard?
Okay.
The New York City thing. Anyway, I'm just calling in because this fake White Hawk guy, he looks weird. He's always lying. And I want to ask him how he knows all this stuff and why is it he says it like the way he wants to say it. He doesn't say it the way how it's supposed to be. He has that left bullshit mentality in his mind.
Keep it clean, Tapface. You said he's lying?
I mean, yeah, he's lying about everything that he's saying. The stuff that he's saying, I want to know where does he get his information, not the news. Why is he saying the way he's saying it? Because the way he's saying it is he's starting trouble.
Like I'm in trouble?
You're starting trouble.
Like I'm starting trouble. Well,
yes,
I guess
starting trouble.
Wow. Well, I think it was the Russians who started the trouble. But I would say that
I'm fucking starting trouble.
Tapface,
I will knock you the fuck out.
Tapface, I gotta let you go, man. You're out of control. You're cussing too much, man. What the heck? I don't know
Jolly
why
fellow.
Tapface is normally a cool guy, but he's for some reason you set him off, man.
I don't know. But I can try to answer the question. I get a lot of my information from the Institute for the Study of War when it comes to specific battlefield plans. I think they release really good maps. They release really good up-to-date information. I get a lot of my information from my personal conversations. I recently interviewed the former Undersecretary of State of Poland. That was a really good interview. He, in fact, was actually part of the protest movement during the Polish martial law during the Soviet Union. That was a great interview. I'm talking to people directly, refugees, Ukrainian citizens, just person-to-person communication. So it isn't, and of course I learned from news sites and NGOs and institutes and stuff like that. But I am trying to have more person-to-person communication. It's part of the reason why I'm here in Ukraine, so I can try to improve that coverage and try to get an on-the-ground perspective.
Before I get to Alex in Sweden, I have a couple of super chats for you. Lord BB42 on Streamlabs says, sick mullet, Dylan.
Thank you. I'm really representing the States over here.
Brandon M asks, so you're for bleeding Russia dry at our economic downfall while using Ukraine as a meat shield? It's one way to put it.
That's a very interesting way to put it. I don't think I'm using Ukraine as a meat shield. There's not a lot of willing meat shields. When you see like ISIS take one of these people and hold them as a meat shield with a gun to their head, they're not usually saying, yes, this is wonderful, I'm loving this, we're fighting for our freedom. They're usually screaming. And it is the Ukrainians who are asking for the support. So I wouldn't call it a meat shield. I don't know a lot of willing meat shields that are fighting for their own sovereignty. And as for America's economic downfall, I have yet to be shown how this aid is going to destroy or hurt the American economy in any significant way. Definitely when it comes to the land lease policy, which has historically been a boom, been very economically useful to the Americans.
Oh, you know what? Why are we overreacting and hurting ourselves with the gas situation? Is the Russia-Ukraine situation hurting our gas prices?
Not that much. I know Biden says it, and I think it was a pre-existing issue. Then this conflict came, and it's an easy thing to kind of throw the label onto. Yeah. It's had some effect, but not really. We take a very, very small amount of our energy resources from Russia.
We have all of these issues going on in America, you know, like the opioid deaths. I think they're still out of control. They've spiked under the shutdowns. The border has been open, and we have like a crisis May 23rd, they're saying, or whenever that thing is, the Title 42 ends. The homelessness epidemic in at least on the coast over here. Inflation.
Got a big issue over here too.
Yeah, the housing market is going crazy. Should we even be bothering with Ukraine? Don't we need to be taking care of home first?
I think a lot of people I feel like this is a spiraling effect, because people will say, well, isn't this issue much more important than this issue? And then somebody else can come in, well, I know this issue is 10 times more important than your issue. People talk about the oppression Olympics. I talk about this kind of like the policy Olympics, where everybody's trying to explain how their stuff is so 10 times more important and doesn't need to be addressed. My belief is I believe we can address all of these issues. I don't believe it's a pick or choose on these issues. Like we either support the Ukrainians or we deal with our opioid epidemic. I think we can do both. The difference is there's more of a consensus on supporting Ukraine than there is a consensus on dealing with the baby formula issue or dealing with the opioids, because there's a lot more money involved in not solving those issues. And that's the difference. In my opinion.
The country's very divided too, and they like to keep us divided, seemingly. Although, I mean, we just are divided. Let me get to Alex in Sweden. I think he's ready here. Alex.
Fantastic. I got 2 more minutes, by the way.
Okay. Thanks, man. Alex, go ahead.
Hi, Hake. Hi, Dylan. I'm going to go straight to Dylan then. Dylan, I was going to ask you, I have spoken to a lot of Polish people here in Sweden, and they're telling me that Poland, when it comes to migrants, is that the migrants they don't have same benefits like they have, for example, when they come to America or in Sweden. It's more of that. Poland is more of a gateway into the rest of the Europe. Is it true that is in Poland?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I had a Polish translator who basically told me the exact same thing, that not only did the Polish government not really want the migrants in the first place, but they also did not give the same amount of support. There was not as many NGOs operating in Poland to offer support. So a lot of people just view it from like government support, but it's not only like the national government. There's also local governments that can provide support, cities, towns, NGOs, just like individual people who can choose to host people if they want to. And that same level of support did not exist in other countries, like Germany, for example.
Yeah, because Poland is supposed to be one of the safest countries in the Europe. Do you feel it that way when you were there?
When I was there, it was extremely safe, but that's my own individual experience. I remember there was actually some people online who was scared that I was going to get stabbed in Poland, but that never happened. It was completely safe. But I was only in Warsaw, in Lublin, Lechna. I wasn't like all over in like Krakow and like all these other places. So I wouldn't be able to tell you because I don't have all the information on it. All I can say is I had a lovely time in Poland, and I want to go back if I can.
And my last question to you, or not, it's not a question, it's more that since you were in Poland, and if it might be a kind of stretch, but if you can, maybe in the future, you should come to like in Scandinavia, like Sweden, and see for yourself the damage this migrant wave have done to the Western world.
Well, thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. We got to end here. But Dylan, if you want to real quick respond to that, go ahead.
Sure.
But we got to wrap up.
I think that I don't think migrants did that much damage to the Western world. I think looking years on right now, the countries that hosted them are not exactly in turmoil or civil war. Or they're going to like experience demographic collapse, or a lot of the doomsday people were projecting. I think when it comes to a lot of the crime statistics, a lot of people try to point out it wasn't because of migrant inflows. A lot of times it had to do with the fact that they changed the categorization for certain crimes. For example, they lessening the bars for things like sexual assault. Used to be higher bars. But of course, anytime you host a large amount of refugees, there can be societal costs that come with it. I think the good thing to do is to be prepared before the crisis happened, because what we see is all these countries scramble after the crisis happened. If you have a centralized game plan in place before it happens, you can handle these crises a lot more effectively and a lot more in a humanitarian nature. And that's one of the main things that from Homo Faber they told me, was that they didn't see a centralized response from the Polish national government. It was the localities that had to pick up the pace, and I want to see that change in the future.
Dylan Burns, 1776, promote your stuff. And we got to wrap up, man. We ran out of time.
I'm always love coming on Hake's show, The Hake Report. But you can find me at Dylan Burns TV. That's DYLANBURNS TV on YouTube. On Twitch, it's the same thing. And on Twitter, it's for my personal account, DYLANBURNS 1776, our nation's founding. You can find me on Twitter there. And please come check out my stuff. I'd really appreciate it. If you want to see the documentary I'm working on, it will be released probably in a few months. So keep an eye out for it. It'll be on my YouTube. Thank you very much for having me on, Hake, and you have a blessed day.
You too, Dylan, and I really appreciated being on the Hippy Dippy Roundtable. You guys are very professional, and it's always a joy.
Thank you.
Take care, man.
Gonna have you on soon again, hopefully, if you're up for it.
Nice. Yeah, I'm always down. Cool.
Awesome. You have a good one.
You as well.